morning everybody, bonjour à tout le monde. Nous allons entamer cette session sur un thème qui est en fait fondamental pour ce 21e siècle, à savoir la prochaine conflagration, la prochaine confrontation du siècle à travers les deux plus grandes puissances économiques de la planète et cette rivalité qu'on essaye de définir entre les États-Unis d'Amérique et la Chine. Donc nous avons eu des parallèles dans l'histoire antique de la Grèce avec une puissance comme Sparte et Athènes, donc une démocratie basée sur le commerce et une oligarchie militaire. Nous avons le même schéma maintenant, sauf qu'il est en inversé. On a une puissance économique émergente basée sur le commerce et une démocratie militaire. Donc ça nous donne un petit peu l'idée de ce qui nous attend. And to address this issue, I'll switch in English. We have an outstanding panel with, to my very left, Anna Ashton, who has been active in US-China relation for most of her career, having different positions, both within government, actually in the Defense Department, and with the Trade and Chamber of Commerce. To her left, we have an outstanding speaker, Mr. Richard Byrne, from the UK, who's a senior advisor of APCO and has had a lifelong interest in China, both within the government and as UK Trade Commissioner and representative also on UK trade in China. In the very early years, he was a personal private secretary of UK Prime Minister, Sir Edward Heath, who has actually opened the relation and the embassy in China ahead of the US and the famous Nixon and Kissinger engagement with China. So we're going to hear very interesting hindsight from you, Mr. Byrne. To his left, we have Dr. Kaouthar Lbiati, Chief Executive Officer and Board Director of a major pharmaceutical company, and who disposes as a Moroccan citizen of an outstanding executive career in the pharmaceutical sector in the US and obviously globally, and we'll have some interesting hindsight on what is taking place in that specific industry within that rivalry. And last but not least, we have Kamran Bokhari, who's a senior director of the New Line Institute, having outstanding experience in defense, intelligence, and private sector interactions within the US government, and also addressing issues of other countries, Canada, UK. So we have obviously, I believe, an expertise that will enable us to brainstorm a little bit what is happening, first of all, and what is coming up in this confrontation. This is a traditional panel that we have had in the Medays for many years, and it's a history in the making. And so we realize, and I will give you the floor, Anna, on what is happening here. We've got this confrontation with we've seen Trump coming up with a trade strategy to counter China's dominance in the industrial sector and competitiveness. And to the greatest surprise, because everybody else caved in, China managed to stand its ground. Can you tell us a little bit why that was the case?
I would be happy to. So I think the reality is that China could stand its ground, right? China is in a position of relative strength, and I think that there may have been some misunderstanding among policy advisors in Washington as to exactly what the balance of power was and who had what leverage. I think that the understanding in China was that China had a lot of leverage now, maybe less leverage during the first Trump administration, but they've had time to prepare, and in the interim, they have come up with a lot of a variety of new tools for responding to what they perceive to be U.S. aggression. And I think that their response has been so far quite effective. It's basically been focused on withholding rare earth minerals and magnets, and those are important for so many sectors. And they really, you know, although the United States used to have the most robust rare earth mining, that is something that the United States has not really had for decades and is trying to recultivate, and many other countries are trying to recultivate for at least the next 10 years, if not longer. There will not be any possibility of completely, of not relying on China a little bit. We'll probably have to rely on China a lot. So that leverage is significant and has proven persuasive.
Thank you very much, Anna. So my next question will be for Mr. Byrne. Are we safe in the next 10 years as far as this confrontation is concerned, based on the rare earth? And if I may ask you, early on, when engaging China, has this potential been acknowledged? I mean, Nixon, by engaging China, realized that he was unleashing a giant, and he has had some private words about, you know, how that could contribute to global growth. Give us your take on the early contacts with the Chinese officials in the early 70s.
Thanks, Anna. I think in the 1970s, Nixon and my old boss, Edward Heath, the British Prime Minister, both saw very clearly that China was going to be a hugely important power, which is why they moved to normalize relations. I don't think anybody could have foreseen how quickly it would develop. I mean, it wasn't until 1978 that Deng Xiaoping came to power and started the open door policy, which led to this extraordinary explosion in private business and economic growth. I mean, famously, you know, 600 million people have been lifted out of poverty in 40 years at a faster rate than we've ever seen anywhere in the world. So I don't think anybody could see how quickly it would happen. And even over the last 10 years, I don't think anybody understood how China would become so strong so soon. And I quite agree with Anna that even in Trump 1, they weren't as strong as they are now. And so the decision makers in Washington miscalculated how China would react when Trump imposed all those tariffs. I mean, if you remember Trump's early words, it was more or less, well, they can come to Washington and negotiate with me. He thought China was going to... farmers who suddenly can't sell any soybeans, automakers who are suddenly facing enormous tariffs on car parts. He gets pressure from his own Republicans in Congress, whereas China controls everything. And they are also more able to provide subsidies and support companies that are suffering as a result of tariffs because of the way the system operates. So China was able to resist. And then, of course, they pulled the rabbit out of the hat with rare earths, which nobody seemed to realize they more or less had a monopoly on. And so when they started controlling the exports of that, Trump was effectively forced to come back to the negotiating table. But to answer your question, are we safe for 10 years? Well, no, not really. We've had what I think was a true
presentation. So there we go. Thank you very much, and apologies for this inconvenience. Very interesting hindsight on the truth that we are currently going through. I had the privilege to moderate a panel early during the COVID, and it was a panel, remote panel we had on the very specific issue. And back then, big issue in this confrontation was the rule of engagement. We have to set a rule of engagement. And it's interesting that we're still, we moved those boundaries, and it looks like we're falling back again on redefining them for at least the foreseeable, if it can be foreseen, decade regarding this confrontation. So that's at least one ray of hope, thanks to the actually leverage that China has managed to build to make sure that they can be balanced, and this is extremely important for the rest of the world, as the consequences will be tremendous. So before going to the inner working of the strategic relations and the inner workings on that dynamic, I'd like to dive into the business dimension of what makes China so strong in industry, and we'll take as an example the biotech industry with Kaouthar. Can you enlighten us on how actually China is using a geopolitical power and its trade in this particular sector, and how did they manage to rise to dominance? I mean, dominant position in that sector?
Yeah. By no means China is in a dominant position in biotechnology. The US is very well positioned, and it is still leading the innovation in biotechnology. And I think maybe the gap is no longer as wide as it used to be, but by no means China is in a dominant position. It is ramping up. The US has been using some instruments of geopolitical power to counteract this rise, rightfully so. I think the national security purpose is one of the reasons why the US is reacting, and I'm going to speak to what are the instruments that the US is using in that front, on that front. There are also some geoeconomic considerations to take into account, notably productivity and competitiveness. So if you take, for example, the biomanufacturing or the industrial manufacturing, if you take the enforcement of the IP, intellectual property, and if you take the protection of data, sensitive data, and the United States and China. So what are the instruments, to answer the question that has been asked by our esteemed moderator? The instruments that are used are the tariffs, and I think Dr. Byrne has mentioned that, but tariffs applying up to 25% tariffs on imported drugs is useless. It has some paradoxical effects on innovation. If you are trying to ramp up your innovation, you are basically slowing down your innovation by doing this. It can trigger some drug shortages because all the active pharmaceutical ingredients, 90% of them come out of China and India, who is dependent on China for that matter. And so this is not the right instrument to use. However, there are other instruments which are regulations. So in 2020, since 2024, there have been something like 4 regulations or policies and executive orders. You have heard several times, if you follow the US media, executive orders by the president. Those are the instruments that have been used. I believe that the US National Biotech Act was the response, the major response to a report that was released this year, earlier this year in April, that has recommended to the federal government to increase the investment in biotechnology at least $15 billion, $15, and to enhance the coordination between several branches and departments in the US, notably the Department of Health, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Justice, if I am not mistaken. So all this is needed if the United States wants to keep its leadership and counteract or out-innovate China in biotech, and also for national security purposes. But I would like to add something. I think the highlight of that report by the Commission was the reforms of FDA, reforms for the optimization of the regulatory purposes. And the reason why it is the epitome of those reforms of FDA are there have been several deals between the US large pharma companies and the small biotech from China on the experimental drugs. The size of the deals in the first half of 2025 was something like 48 billion that was poured, and this has exceeded or completely eclipsed the $45 billion that was the total spend all over 2024. So those deals are ramping up, and the administration is reacting. The New York Times in October has leaked an information according to which there will be a new executive order that is in the making that seeks to restrict those kind of deals. So on top of the reforms of FDA that I have just mentioned, there will be an executive order that will try to restrict those kind of deals, for example, by I would say heightening the scrutiny on those deals. There will be a commission that will be looking into that. Last year, I was invited by Medays, and I spoke with my friend Anna, and I spoke about the Biosecure Act that was meant to decouple the US pharmaceutical companies from the contract research organization from China. Well, let me tell you, give you an update, that bill is still pending because it's not easy, even if you want to do nearshore. US is still dominating the biotech. I personally believe that it will continue to dominate the biotech industry. China is ramping up. It is a significant competitor. And the US will continue to do what it has always done, which is innovate and focus. And I hope to be here next year or in 2 years to tell you more about it.
Okay, so thank you very much for this insightful look at the dynamics between the US pharma industrial complex and the Chinese competition. And I want to bring it back actually to the rest of the world. We are at risk of unraveling globalization as we know it, and innovation and competitiveness. We've seen Chinese investments, for example, here in Tangier on the automobile sector with gigafactories in the range of almost 30 billions, inclusive growth, jobs. And so it's a new offer for countries in the south that China is doing in trying to relocating its global supply chain and making it more resilient. That implies for the host country to have free trade agreements unrestricted with all the partners and try to navigate a very thin line. And so, Kamran, my question to you is how can countries, besides those two protagonists, protect their interests and not hedge any bets on one or the other? To Kamran, sorry.
Thank you so much, Khalid. Thank you to Medays and Amadeus for inviting me. And it's great to be with my co-panelists. I think there are two things that all countries of the world need to understand. And they both, one has to do with what is the US doing and where is the US headed? What does that mean for the world? And what is happening to China and what are the implications of that? So let me start with the US first. I think what we are seeing right now is the beginning of the making of a new order, a new geostrategy by which the United States is going to manage the global system. The order that existed since the end of World War II is largely gone. And what do I mean by that? I think what this administration, and it's hard to decipher, so, you know, I just want to put that out. This is more analysis than intelligence. It seems like the United States has a strategy that is based on the United States retrenching itself from the role of sort of the primary net security guarantor. And it is reaching out to allied and partner nations in different regions of the world to take that primary responsibility, with the US going into a secondary role. Now, you see this happening in Europe in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, where the United States is trying to bring an end to that war and then leave it to the Europeans to figure out a new security architecture for the continent and its security. We're seeing some of this in the Middle East with the efforts to bring an end to the war and the conflict in Gaza. And we see that happening with the Trump White House engaging Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel at the same time.
Kamran, is this necessary or opportunity?
This is necessary in the sense that this is where the Trump administration found itself when it came to office. So in it, there may be opportunity. It is necessary. Let's switch to China. When it comes to China, there's a bit of a difference in this strategy. There's a variance here. The variance is that the United States is an oceanic power, and while it wants to retrench itself from security, from the responsibility to deal with land-based conflicts, it is not going to give up its dominance in the maritime space, which has implications for China. Yes, there's an architecture developing with the Quad, with AUKUS, and now with the sort of trilateral understanding between Japan, Australia, and the United States, and Philippines is a player in there as well, and the future of Taiwan. But this is a space that the US will be engaged in. And so this is the model that the US seems to be moving towards. And the question is that how does this shape the rivalry with China? So that brings me to the point on China. So where is China headed? Well, China is an interesting spot. On one hand, on a technological and geoeconomic level, it would be fair to say that it's almost a peer competitor to the United States. But militarily, it is not, and there are some fault lines within the Chinese system that create uncertainty for China's overall status. Number one is that Chinese growth rates have declined substantially. Now, it's very hard for them to even keep up, say, 4 or 5%. We all know about the housing crisis. We all know about how there is this backlash to heavy Are they structural? To what extent are they? If they are, then to what extent? And if they are short-term, then again, how short-term? So those are questions that need to be addressed. Then there is this effort by President Xi to turn what has been essentially been a bureaucratized, institutionalized, collective leadership of authoritarian. It's an authoritarian state, but there was collective leadership from the Chinese Communist Party into sort of a personal fiefdom, if you will. How does that impact what China is about to do? We see certain vulnerabilities. Do have, and I agree with Anne, that there is considerable leverage. But Xi is being forced to negotiate with the United States as well. Just as the United States needs to engage, the reverse is also true. What do they need? They need the lifting of or easing of restrictions on trade, on investments, and technology. Because the Chinese economy needs to be stabilized before they can move forward. So for the rest of the world, I think it's very important to understand the Chinese imperatives and constraints and the American imperatives and constraints.
Thank you very much. Obviously, this raises... thank you. And so this raises fundamental questions. We have only half an hour, and I want to dedicate at least 15 minutes for questions from our distinguished audience. And I just want to throw, we have a structural feature now of the global system settling in, and I just want to know how can middle powers develop their strategies, and how will that affect even the notion of multilateralism as we know it. So I'd like to address both our speakers here. First of all, Mr. Burns, how do you see multilateralism morph into these influences? Can you hit the mic, please?
I think multilateralism to a certain extent is broken down. I mean, you've seen the WTO has basically disappeared as a relevant organization as people seek bilateral trade agreements. As Kamran was saying, the US is retreating into itself and expecting Europe and the rest of the world to sort out their own problems. They obviously are still concerned about China, but I think it's really every region and every country for themselves nowadays, particularly for smaller countries. So you even see within Europe, actually there hasn't been the strengthening that you would have hoped amongst all the EU member states in the response to what's happening geopolitically. They're still arguing amongst themselves. They still have too much different regulation. They haven't yet organized themselves in Europe to be more efficient and more competitive, and therefore more effective and stronger as a regional power. So I think we're going to continue to see bilateral agreements as everybody looks after their own interests, which is a shame, because multilateralism after the Second World War is what created stability and economic growth.
So let's hope we won't revert into 19th century nationalism and imperialism. And we hope for the best for the future. But Anna, we're in Africa, and we really need to understand how can African emerging economies leverage this rivalry most effectively. If you can give us a hint on what countries in our continent can do in the current conjuncture.
Sure. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there is a benefit to there being this more intense competition between the US and China. And that benefit is that countries that are seeking to develop with the assistance of investment from one or the other have the opportunity to play them off against each other. But at the same time, the investment that is coming out of China and the United States is ultimately, for their own purposes. It's not It's not altruistic. And so it is easy to end up in a situation where the investment is much better for the investor than it is for the country that is getting the investment. And I think what we've seen in so many cases, for instance, with critical minerals, is that countries that have these rich deposits of critical minerals, and there are many of those countries in Africa, are taken advantage of. Their raw materials are extracted, but they don't have an opportunity to move up the value chain.
So Anna, let me take you on that, on the
Yeah.
cuff. Basically, we got two models. We've seen how China engages with the battery technology in Morocco with gigafactories, and we know how minerals are being dealt with all the other Western multinational companies, Glencore and the likes. Is there a difference in approach towards the continent between a Chinese approach, which we all hope, but both approaches would be as inclusive as possible, aimed at building capacities for the local generation of value of these resources? Which partner and how can African countries use this argument to try to orient a little bit this competition towards better local value generation in the continent?
So I think that, by and large, China has done a better job of following through on some of its commitments to various countries where it has invested. But China also has to deal with its domestic population not wanting to see too many resources thrown into the interests of other countries, because, as Kamran mentioned, their economy is struggling. There's 19% youth unemployment. They may be a one-party system, but they still have constituents that they have to contend with and listen to. China's not going to easily be convinced to give more, for instance, to build infrastructure that is necessary in order to do processing of minerals, as well as just extraction. But one way to convince China to do that is to also court investment from US and Western allies and partners, not just less the governments and more the companies, and see if the possibility of the Western companies coming in and doing more causes China to up its offers.
And there are indeed complementary offers on the investment side for the US and on the knowledge and the more inclusive approach with China and infrastructure building that very few countries are capable of rolling out on the continent. I mean, obviously, China is the first trade partners of pretty much all African countries, with the exception of Morocco and perhaps Senegal. So it's very impressive that trade record that China has achieved vis-à-vis the continent. Isn't there a logic also for China vis-à-vis its own employment challenges? And also, I'm also concerned with the aging of this population, and also the threat we've seen, not them controlling global waters. It makes total sense to build distributed supply chains, because then you undermine completely a military embargo of the likes of World War II with Japan and the US. So when you see this, is there light at the end of the tunnel of having not only US and China, but also big elephants in the room like Europe and other emerging powers getting involved in that new architecture that we may see unfolding? And that question is addressed to all of you. If you want to address Kamran, would you like to add something to it?
Yeah, thank you. Picking up from what Anne said, we have to understand that, and and it's natural, because China's next door, the United States is too far, Russia is embroiled in Ukraine, so they don't have much of a choice. But the Central Asian nations have been courting the Europeans and the Americans and the Canadians, say, look, we would like you to come and do more business with us. The problem begins where they're used to the Chinese state having an authority to cut large checks, to invest money in just sort of like a very short period of time. It doesn't take long for the decision to be made. They are still grappling with the Western model where it needs to make business sense for Western companies. If they're going to invest, they need to see a potential return on investment. And so the Central Asians are used to what the Chinese are doing, and they're having a hard time sort of getting the Americans attracted, or at least appear as attractive for investments because of this paradigm. And I think that the Chinese also have a problem in the sense that if you look at sort of this BRI project, the biggest BRI project is in Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and I'm talking by just value. So the allocation is 62 billion. I think roughly 45 of that has already been spent, 45 billion. And that investment hasn't produced the return for the Chinese. In fact, Chinese workers have been killed in Pakistan. And there are other security issues related to the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. So there is sort of this emerging model where the Chinese go into a country that is sort of malleable and they can do business with. The idea is that if we put money, we will benefit from it, and so will the country that we're investing in. But what has happened from Sri Lanka to Pakistan to Zambia and other places is that those countries are far worse off now. They're more in debt. And the Pakistanis keep asking for a rollover of existing Chinese loans. So these are certain things I think that countries in Africa need to think about, these dynamics, as they navigate and try to sort of find that sweet spot between Chinese investments and American investments.
Interestingly enough, in the case of Morocco, which is I'm more familiar with, China comes in Morocco with those gigafactory in a joint venture mode. So they need local partners that can also bring in investments. How sustainable you think this approach can be, and how can it be opened to other partners other than China? We've seen, for example, Goshen is 20% Volkswagen. So we have German partners investing in Morocco through a Chinese company that they co-own. How do you see these models unfolding over the continent?
That's a question for me.
For all of you, this is an open question to the panel, and I want to make sure, yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think the investments in battery technology and so on in Morocco differ from the Belt and Road investments in infrastructure, which, as Kamran said, often don't make any money for China and don't do much good in the country they're invested in. Belt and Road was a strategic project, obviously, to build influence and develop networks of friends throughout the developing world. And I think the same thing happened in Africa as happened in Central Asia. I mean, in Kenya, for example, they built an enormous railway, I think from Mombasa to Nairobi. It's imposed huge debt problems on the Kenyan government. They also imported Chinese laborers to build it, so it didn't even create any jobs for local Kenyans. So I think Belt and Road hasn't been quite so. I think the enthusiasm for Chinese investment from Belt and Road countries has lessened. But the sort of investments here are to support Chinese industry in other parts of the world. I mean, Morocco's geographical advantage right next to Europe means that the batteries that are made here are being exported to Europe, where China is is sending loads of electric vehicles and is now buying factories. For example, the Chery factory, the China electric vehicle factory, they've just bought in Barcelona.
So is it up to the host country?
Is getting its batteries from Morocco.
So is it up to the host country to develop better conditions, not to fall in a Belt and Road Initiative trap?
Yes, but I think the sort of investments you're getting here, they need to do joint ventures. They need local workers and support, because they're manufacturing for export to nearby regions and to support their own advanced manufacturing elsewhere, or their products that are being sold elsewhere.
Which could be the best example for the continent.
Yes.
So Anna, would you like to jump on it?
I'd like to add to that. So, I absolutely think that the lesson that the Chinese learned from early BRI projects in particular is that the temptation to export their workers and to give these loans that created large debts for the countries involved was not worth it. And it backfired on them. So now the joint venture model, it's both more economical from their standpoint, and it gives the community that is receiving the investment a lot more incentive to take care of that investment and a lot more opportunity to benefit from it. I would point out that you know, a joint venture is only as good as its partners, and the regulations surrounding it. But you know, China had this model of joint ventures for investment in its own country for the last, 30 years. And that joint venture model worked very well for China when it came to an accelerating development of the economy. So the opportunity that China saw in attracting joint venture type foreign investment is an opportunity that other countries very likely can take advantage of in a similar way. So it's worth studying how China did that.
So, yes, Kaouthar, please.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate everyone's concern about the debt trap, potentially, but I do also see opportunities in that rivalry, opportunities for emerging economies and for the developing world, that is. Among the opportunities that I see, I mean, I will start slow. These countries, US and China, are and LATAM, Latin America as well, could leverage that diplomacy to expand market access to their products in those countries and vice versa. So this is the basic level. The emerging economies can be a little bit more sophisticated when negotiating a tech transfer, okay? And this is to echo what has been just said by all the co-panelists. It's a negotiation talent when you ask for when you attract investment or when you ask for a technology to be transferred to you, you can negotiate a technical cooperation and some favorable terms that makes R&D happen in your soil. And so you build that level of expertise. And speaking about biotechnology, you can build level of expertise in biomanufacturing that could solve local problems, but also the problems of supply chain resilience. One more thing that is very important where I see the opportunity happening is the digital inclusion, okay? If we are speaking about data sovereignty, if we want the equity to be the equity in the technological development, if we want that gap not to be very wide, this is the opportunity to negotiate a digital inclusion. And in that, we need to negotiate a reciprocity of data sharing, okay? It's a reciprocity of data sharing, and the quality of data that is both countries will have access to and that our countries would have access to is also important. Why? We call this technically an AI-ready kind of data. This is very important for the research and development. The large language models that are used for research and development are hungry of data, but not any kind of data. So that's the digital inclusion I am speaking about. And last but not least, since we are speaking about tech, is the cybersecurity collaboration. I think international collaboration and cooperation on the methods of protection against cyber harm is very important. The ability of the emerging countries to have access to those protection methods, particularly in the area of biotech, is essential if we want to protect the genomic and the biological data that are generated in our hospitals, labs, etc. This is the new gold, is the data. Thank you.
Okay, and we're very happy to have competing offers regarding this specific issue. And so, as promised, we have 15 minutes open to the floor. If there are any questions, please introduce yourself. So, first the gentleman in back row middle, and then Olivier Do, and then you. Please go ahead. Is there a microphone to be given to the speakers? There's the question too.
My question is open to the panelists, to whomever thinks they have a better answer would be appropriate. So I'll try to keep, first of all, my name is Machakawi, and I'll try to keep my question fairly simple and fairly short. In the context of US-China trade relations, was the United States withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership a mistake?
Can you repeat that? Which partnership?
Was the United States withdrawal from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a mistake?
Anna?
Yes. The United States withdrawal from the that it currently relies on China to provide. It needs to have well-negotiated trade agreements with other partners, and it needs to be pursuing more of the so-called, nearshoring and friendshoring that was talked about during the Biden administration. However, the focus of the United States in trying to ramp up competition with China still is pretty much domestic. There is, this burgeoning collaboration with partners on some fronts, but the push is more for opportunities within the United States. So yes, it was a mistake. It's not a mistake that's going to be undone anytime soon, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. Another question, please raise your hand and grab the mic.
So the question is, due to the
How?
No, I'm talking about how internally, since the internal economy of China isn't that strong, is imbalanced to the exportations.
Okay. Would you like to address this issue?
I'd be happy to start, but I know that my colleagues will also have their thoughts. I think, China has been pretty open about its expectation that growth is going to be slower for the foreseeable future. That it could not sustain, double-digit growth forever, and now the focus is on quality over quantity, they say. Nevertheless, the slow growth is a problem, and that's why they have policies like dual circulation, which are meant to encourage more domestic consumption so that they can be more self-reliant and less dependent on exports for their economic growth going forward. But it seems to me that they are far from figuring out exactly what kind of policy will help to stimulate that consumption. They're trying lots of different things, but they're mostly kind of muddling through.
Kamran?
Yeah, I would just add to what Anne said that, look, if you are, the Chinese public, gone are the days when you were willing to work for low wages. There's an expectation now that we will make a certain amount of living. And that's not happening. And that is the imperative. I mean, you have to understand that the Chinese Communist Party, the social contract it has with its people, with Chinese people at large, is that don't worry about politics and we will give you economic prosperity. We will, to make China great again or whatever. But that is sort of the impact. And if so, in what time period? And if it cannot be solved and it lingers on, then what kind of political outcomes does this lead to? Does this lead to unrest? And that has to be tied to what is happening at the elite level, what is happening to the Chinese Communist Party because of what Xi's policies and trying to amass power for himself and putting his people in place. So these are things that will also determine what will happen, because you need to have, we assume Chinese growth because we think things will remain the same, but we need to take a look and drop altitude and say, what is happening at the political level because of this slowdown?
Thank you very much. We have room for one more question because I'd like to give the last word to the panel. We have, earlier he raised his hand first behind you. Please, a microphone, identify yourself and the question and to whom you'd like to address it to.
Thank you so much. I have a question which is particularly related to a special issue. It's the demographic issue that China has been facing recently. As most of us know, the population of China has been declined, I think since it's been 2 or 3 years. And of course, this means less manpower for economic development, for innovation, for technological development, and also more pressure on salaries, wages, and also on social security systems. So my question is precisely, do you think this issue would have, on the long run, an impact on the balance of power between the two superpowers?
In Europe will be a major issue. Whether it will impact innovation, no, I don't think so, because they are producing, I think, the maximum rate of engineers per capita compared to other parts of the world, including the US, including Europe. So I don't think that innovation will be the impact. However, on their social security and wages, this may be an issue. I think the point that was mentioned by my co-panelist is very rings a bell for me. It's the quality of jobs that the Chinese people would want to do or do not want to do anymore. Where those, will AI be sufficient to absorb that low quality of jobs? I don't know.
Okay, one last question before we wrap up the session. Yeah, try first, see if it works. Hit the mic. Okay, it works.
Thank you very much. My question is how China becomes a very big country in development, industry, and technology behind USA. Is that depends on the education of people, or depends also to this how to be more than how to do? Thank you very much. Because we have to take this example from the Chinese to do the same, because we need to be the men to go directly to the goals for the production of the things very important for the country.
So more specifically, the question is
that shortly.
How the Chinese do to become the very important land country in the world behind USA is that depends on the education of the people and or discipline of these people, because China are a lot of people, but they are very disciplined in the world.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's education and it's a state sponsorship of critical areas, I believe.
So it's governance, strong leadership.
Sponsorship.
Who would like to address this question? You'll have a take on it, and this will be our closing words,
Yeah,
by the way.
I mean, if you look at the 5-year plan that's just announced, there's a huge focus on state-sponsored investment in technology so that China becomes self-sufficient in as many technologies as possible, as soon as possible. And they're very aware that they have an aging population. I think by 2050, about a third of the population will be.
Who would like to take next one?
I just want to go back to the US-China thing in closing. The United States, from the behavior of both the Biden administration and the current White House, there isn't much difference. It seems that the United States has accepted that this idea of countering China that was, the pivot to Asia under Obama, that whole discourse has matured. I think there's a realization that the United States will have to work with China. There will need to be an accommodation, if you will, and eventually there needs to be a system. The conundrum that the United States faces is, how do we have a geo-economic relationship with China and not have Beijing challenge us militarily? That's the conundrum that I don't think we're going to solve anytime soon, and it's going to be an irritant in this relationship.
Okay, thank you very much. You give us.
Important to look at the two models that the United States and China offer, and understand that the best model is probably somewhere in between. The United States has been, especially since the 80s, very, very fervently pro-free market capitalism. China has embraced capitalism to a certain extent by inviting in investment and engaging with the world, but has a closed capital account and certainly has much more state-directed economic development. That has worked well for China, except for the fact that provide great solutions for social problems like social safety net needs. So in order to take the best from both, I would say look at what has worked in each country and what hasn't, and draw from there.
Yeah, long-term strategy as well for state role.
Yeah, I think in this rivalry, it will end up by a conversation and collaboration between the US and China. That's my belief. The world cannot afford a decoupling, decoupling. It's or 2 blocks, 3 blocks. It's just not possible. Maybe globalization is dead, but a new architecture is needed. I personally believe that the model that will succeed is the model that leverages its soft power, and what I mean is the model that is the country that uses the
is unknown, but I agree, in the end, China and the United States are going to have to work together and collaborate. That neither of them can afford to decouple. China needs the US market, the US needs China. As Kamran has said, I think the biggest underlying issue is how they manage to work more closely together on trade, investment, and economics without avoiding some kind of clash militarily over sovereignty over, you know, which part of East Asia or the Pacific or the other places where China is clearly asserting itself. So there's a lot that we don't know how it will work out, but